I'm Sean, just going to ask some questions. And today I want to ask things about budgeting. Tell me who you are and what your role is here.
So my name's Carrielyn Reynolds, and I am the certified financial coach here at New Dimensions Federal Credit Union. And what I do is I promote financial literacy. I go into schools, I go into businesses, and talk about the importance of saving and budgeting and why credit's important, and really just maybe help people get to where they want to be, help them achieve their goals.
That's really important. That's awesome. So why is it so many people avoid creating a budget, even when they know that they need one?
So I think a lot of people avoid creating a budget because they just don't know where to start. Like a lot of people will budget like their car payment, their mortgage, they'll budget for their cell phone, but they don't necessarily budget for their everyday spending. They won't budget for their stops for their caffeine in the morning, and they don't budget for maybe lunches out. If they think about it and they go to one of their local coffee shops and they're spending $5 a day, that's $25 a week. That's what, $100 a month in just coffee. If they were to go once or twice a week, they're going to cut that in half, or even more if they only went once a week. So I think that because they aren't budgeting for everything, they're just budgeting for the big things, they don't necessarily know where their money's going. And I just think that they don't know really how to budget. There's so many different budgeting, ways to budget, whether it's the zero budgeting or the 50-30-20 budget. I think when people think about budgeting, they just think it's more of a restriction instead of being like, oh, it's where my money's going. I know a lot of my friends and even a lot of the members I work with, we'll come in and we'll talk about a budget. And they're like, yeah, I have a budget. I make sure I pay this, this, and this. And I'm like, what about gas? What about your groceries? Things like that.
Sounds a little bit like budgeting and bad budgeting is formed through habits.
Absolutely.
So you get used to doing something like buying that coffee, or and then it gets out of control, and then it just becomes something you do.
Right. So I know, like for me personally, like I used to stop at the gas station every morning and get a breakfast sandwich. And because it was on my way to work, it was just like that habit. I'm just going to pull in and do this. So I've stopped getting off the interstate on that exit. I make sure I get my gas before I go to work. So that way there's no reason for me to get off the interstate on my way to work. Just those little habits of changing, like I said, your route to work will make you not actually stop at the gas station because now you're just not going to be that, heading in that direction.
What do you feel like the biggest misconception people have about budgeting?
I really think that people are afraid that it's going to restrict them and they're not going to be able to do the things they want to do. When reality is, if you budget and you plan for those things that you want to do, you're going to be able to do them. Whether it's you want to take a trip or you want to be able to go away for the weekend, if you budget those things in, you're going to have the money to do that instead of going, oh, I want to go away in a couple weeks, but I'm not going to budget for it. And then I'm just going to wing it. And then if you wing it, that's where like debt comes in because you don't really have the extra funds set aside for those things.
It all feels so overwhelming. So how can you explain it in a way that somebody who has never budgeted before can understand how to begin budgeting?
So I always say, go through your bank statements for like the last 3 months or so and write down where you're spending your money. What are you spending your money on? How many times do you go to, we'll say Walmart or Hannaford or Shaw's or Dunkin' or any of the other coffee shops, but really just where's your money going? So I think that's the biggest thing that people should start doing because it's hard to create a budget if you don't have accurate numbers. A lot of times when I meet with somebody to budget, I'll say, have a good idea of what you spend your money on. How much do you spend in a month in gas? A lot of people can't tell me that. So then we have to break it down to how much does it cost to fill your car? How many times a week do you fill your car? In order to get just a good, estimate. Same with like groceries. People are like, yeah, I spend like $30 or how does it go? No, I spend probably like $100 a week on groceries. But when you look at their account, they might spend $100 on Saturday, but what about throughout the week? It's those little extra stops that people do not budget for. I really think that in addition to making sure you go through your accounts, for 3 months or so, but think about the other things that happen throughout the year. Holidays are a big one that people don't budget for. It's not like these holidays just come up and surprise us. It's not like, oh my gosh, it's December. I need to save, a few $100s for Christmas. Or how about we start, in January? Let's put $25 a week away. At that point, you're going to have, $1,300 saved just to get you started.
So it sounds like budgeting creates a lot of freedom once you understand your budget. How does that all work around being able to kind of feel less restrictive? And have you seen that when you help somebody build that budget, that their life kind of opens up a little bit?
Yeah. So helping somebody build a budget, it goes from being like, I don't know where my money's going. I'm late on my car payment to my bills are paid on time. I have money in my savings account. I have that emergency fund. And I really, preach that emergency fund because it's the what ifs. Even, at my home life, my kids, they and their friends. We had a conversation just sitting around my kitchen table. I made dinner the other night and a bunch of their friends came over. And I was like, how many of you have an emergency fund? Because they come to me with their money problems and things like that. I'm like, you all should have, honestly, 5 grand saved. Because what happens if you need an apartment? You can't live at home anymore. One of their friends lives in a hotel during the week. So he's been crashing on my couch because they all hang out together on the weekends. But I said to him the other day, I said, what happens when you get laid off? You need to have money set aside for an apartment. I said, unless you can go home. And some kids don't have the option once they leave to go home. So making sure they have that money set aside for the what ifs.
That's true. Is there ever a perfect time to start, you know, paying off that debt, right? Because ideally, this is, you budget so that you're able to understand where your debts are and how you can tackle them. So is there a good time to start tackling that? And would you even say maybe it's after you've identified your budget?
Yeah, so you definitely need to go through your budget and only include the minimum payments. So if you have a couple credit cards, you have, a car payment, things like that. What is the bare minimum that you have to pay? Whether it's a credit card that's $40, a car payment that's $300, because once you have the bare minimum, then you're going to see how much extra money you have. And then at that extra money, you can really take and go, okay, I'm going to try the snowball effect and I'm going to pay off my lowest credit card first. Okay, so all my extra money is going towards that. Instead of sending all your debt an extra $50, because you're really not going to see anything change. And I feel like if they aren't seeing things changed, then they just get discouraged. They're like, this isn't working. But if you're throwing $300 extra to a credit card and you see the balance go down, that's that motivation piece. Like, oh, it's going down. I can see it. And then once that gets paid off, you take that, whatever you're sending. So say if it's $300 extra and a $50 payment, you take that $350 and send it to the next one. It's the same amount of money. You're just reallocating your funds at that point. So really, as soon as you figure out how much extra you actually have, and the sooner the better.
So once people have identified it, why do people still put off tackling their debt?
I think they're just overwhelmed. Cost of living is so expensive that a lot of people really don't even have the extra money to tackle debt. They're really just the minimum. They can afford the $50. Okay, but what if you're using your credit card to help supplement your income? That $50 is going to go up and up, which means you're going to have less and less money to try to tackle your debt.
Yeah, and I hear it all the time, right? Everybody wants to save money and they say, well, I'm going to start saving next month. But what does that do to somebody who maybe not, who hasn't even identified their budget or who hasn't started to tackle their debt? Will they be able to save? And what is that like?
So I think if people are like, I'll start next month, I think next month's going to roll around and they're going to say, I'll start next month. And then they just keep pushing it off and off and off. And I think a lot of times that people are like, how am I supposed to save if I have this debt? So it's like one or the other. Well, if once you have your budget and you know what you have extra, then it's like, okay, I have $300 a month extra. I'm going to put, $100 in my savings account, but $200 in something else. And the more you can do that, it's slow, but that momentum will build up. And now by the end of the year, you're going to have $1,200 saved, and $2,400 in less debt.
I'm sure you've heard this before, but what advice do you have for somebody who says, I live paycheck to paycheck and I just can't save any money and I can't end up tackling any of that debt because it's tight?
Yeah. So my best advice to something like that is look at your budget, because really, where's your money going? I mean, I understand you're living paycheck to paycheck, and a lot of us are. A lot of our families are. Heating oil is super expensive, holidays, car insurance, groceries themselves have gone up so much that I remember pre-COVID, I was spending $75 a week. I'm up to $250 now, and I don't cook. So I mean, there's a lot of just extras that are just this, I buy the same stuff. But I think what they should be doing is figure out where their money is going and then cut back. Again, if you spend, $100 a month at your local coffee shop, go once. And I always tell people, go on Mondays. Because let's face it, you're going to need some caffeine on Mondays. And then maybe, you know what, even go on Fridays and reward yourself for not going Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Those small little steps are actually going to save them a bunch of money. And a lot of times they don't think about the overall cost, whether it's the monthly cost or the yearly cost. I had a friend of mine, her husband said to me, I'm going to get this streaming music platform. And he goes, it's $10 a month. And without missing a beat, I go, it's $120 a year. This was like 3 years ago. He did not get it because he's like, oh, it's only $10 a month. I can afford that. But it's $120 a year that you're paying instead of, being free. So I think that's a lot of it. I think that maybe setting up where you don't even see it come out of your account. So a lot of times your payroll has the option to split your paychecks. So even if you put $25, and I always say, put it somewhere where you don't have access to it unless you have to go into that financial institution and get it. You can get a debit card wherever, but if you have it sent somewhere else, it's not part of your actual budget. And you're always saving. Even $25 a week. Like I said, that's $1,300 a year that you probably wouldn't miss. And a lot of people are like, well, that's, what if I need that $25? I'm like, for what? What are you spending $25 on that you probably could give up?
Do you think they're afraid of maybe messing up, right? $25 doesn't seem like that much, right? A week, that's not that bad. But do you feel like it's overwhelming to certain people that the fear of saving that money or maybe the fear of spending that money overwhelms them a little bit so they don't actually do anything? And is the not doing anything a worse financial decision than tackling that debt or starting that budget?
No, absolutely. I think not doing anything is the worst thing you can do. Even if you're saving, maybe you can't do 25, maybe you can only do 10. But at the end of the year, that's $520, whether it's for your emergency fund or you're going to put a big chunk down maybe to pay off some of your credit card debt, things like that. I think that a lot of people are afraid of messing up. They can't stick to that budget. And that's what I always tell people. Budgeting is one of those things that you have to believe in. You have to want to stick to it. And it's okay if you don't budget the way I budget. Everybody budgets differently. But it's got to be something that you believe will work for you and your family and something that you're going to stick to. If you find out, 6 months down the road that your budget's not necessarily working for you, revamp it. As long as you're doing something to actively manage your finances instead of just letting it go in your account and swiping your cards and hoping the money comes out for your bills and things like that, just kind of like winging a prayer pretty much. If you have the ability to kind of, like I said, keep track of it, know what's going on, and then if it doesn't work, revamp it. Even after the first month, revamp it. Because it might take a little bit of like, oh, this isn't working, but this part is. Okay, so maybe I'm going to try this and this. Again, it's your budget. Whatever works for you is really the main goal.
Obviously, you're very adept when it comes to budgeting. So tell me something that you wish you had known when you were younger.
That $10 a week is not that much money. You need to be putting that away. A little bit adds up to a lot. If it's $10, $25, chances are you couldn't tell me where you spent your last $25. And if you can't tell me where you spent your last $25, tells me that you probably could save it.
If you could have listeners with one financial challenge to complete in the next 24 hours or maybe even 24 days, what would it be?
I would try to do the no spend challenge. So that is one where you buy your necessities, okay? But you're not going to stop and get your caffeine in the morning. You're going to make it at home. So if you like a certain coffee brand, see if you can buy it at home and make it at home. Pack your lunches. Just try not to spend anything out of the ordinary, like just your necessities. And really take that money that you would have spent and put it in your savings account. How much can you save, in 24 hours or just one day? Sometimes people can't do a full 24 hours and it's a day to day. Okay, my goal today is I'm not going to spend any money. I'm going to bring my breakfast, I'm going to bring my coffee, and I'm going to bring my lunch. Because really that's could be $20 a day that you're saving right there. So if they could do it, even for a week, that's what? $140 they're saving? Is that the right math? Something like that. Or 7 days a week, So just really like the no spending challenge. And a lot of people can't do that.
Right.
The thought of not spending money, I think, scares people. Even if it's something that they do and they have the money for, but just not doing it, like not stopping for coffee, not stopping and buying your lunch.
Well, for me, the big takeaway has been that there's a large fear around saving money and then the potential for feeling as though you're going to spend that money. and maybe foolishly. But one key thing that I took from this conversation is that if I don't really know where the money came from, then I probably could save it. And I think that's key, right? I can easily throw away $20 here and there at a fast food restaurant. And I think nothing of it when I could be saving that money and, putting that away for a vacation somewhere, which I feel like some of my friends and other people are able to go across the country. And I always wonder, man, how are they able to do that? Really, it starts here. And so
Yep.
it's very inspiring. And I appreciate today's conversation.
Yeah.
So I'm Sean Packard, and today I had the wonderful opportunity to talk with
Carrielyn Reynolds, Interventions Certified Financial Coach.
New dimension.